Welcome to the Che Institute's Scientific Innovation Series. I'm Sui-Hong Lee, who is a professor of psychology at Seoul National University. Neuroscientists are developing interesting ways to understand and interact with the brain. Can you read people's thoughts from their brain responses? And can the principles of AI or games contribute to our understanding of the human brain? Today, three exceptional scholars will introduce their unique and captivating approaches to the brain and share their findings.
Hello, I'm going to talk about brain power, the psychology and neuroscience of performance. Life feels like a race. The margins between winning and losing feel very slim, and it causes a lot of stress for people because you feel there's not much room for error. This is most prominent in athletic performance or musical performance, but we also feel these pressures in school, at work, trying to get the grades you want, trying to get the job you want, trying to get the promotion that you need. All of this feels like a race, and it causes a lot of stress when you're trying to achieve success. And so the question is, how can you be your best? How can you achieve what you want? In other words, like what would you do to gain better grades or admission to a school, victory in a sport, success, whether it's money or prestige, or importantly, happiness. How do you achieve happiness? You feel that you need to achieve some of these things to gain happiness. This kind of feels like an infomercial where you're getting all these benefits. And so what I'm going to talk about today is what psychology and neuroscience have to tell us about how to achieve what you want. Now, many of you think that in order to achieve these things, in order to gain success, you have to push yourself to the limit, push yourself as hard as you can, and that's how you are going to achieve your goals. And you may be feeling pressures from others, maybe other teachers or guardians or parents or family members or friends, keep pushing you, to work as hard as you can, don't sleep, don't eat, don't exercise, just work, work, work. This is what some people think is the way to achieve success, but that's a problem. That's an error. And in fact, the summary of my talk today is to relax and to not push yourself to the limit, because the way you're going to achieve optimal brain performance is if you dial back a little and relax a little and focus better through some of the tips that I'm going to share with you today. This is Mount Everest, famous for being a mountain that people climb because it exists. Major physical challenge, mental challenge to achieve it. There's a fun kind of meme and quote where people say that every dead body, a lot of people die, unfortunately, trying to climb this mountain. Every dead body on Mount Everest was once a very highly motivated person. So motivation, working hard, pushing yourself too much is not always a good thing. There's this excellent book by Sion Beilock, now president of Dartmouth University, that will guide a lot of the things I have to share today. She talks about how athletes under pressure, they actually hurt their performance by trying to control it. And when you try to control your performance too much, when you push yourself too much, this control will actually paralyze you and make you perform worse. And we know from brain science that this is because your prefrontal cortex becomes overactive. This is a very famous kind of curve principle in psychology and neuroscience, where on the x-axis you have the degree of arousal, and you can replace arousal with stress, with anxiety, with effort. Just basically you're trying or feeling stress. You can put that on the x-axis, and then the quality of performance is on the y-axis. And a lot of us think that just the harder you work, the more you're aroused, the more focused you are, the more motivated you are. People think that that's what leads to better performance in these tasks. But that's really only the case for super easy tasks that don't require a lot of skill. And so what you see here is in the blue curve, and especially the red curve is what characterizes most things that you care about: doing well in school, winning a race, performing on the piano. The performance in complex tasks, which again characterizes most of the high pressure situations. What psychology and neuroscience have to tell us is that the more you're aroused, the more stress you feel, the more anxious you feel, the harder you try, your performance is actually going to start to go down at the high levels of arousal. And that the sweet spot or the optimal performance you're going to find comes somewhere in the middle. In other words, moderation is better. So here are some interesting statistics. We have lots of good statistics from professional sports. Making a free throw in basketball, it's only you and the goal, and yet people's performance goes up and down even if you're a highly paid athlete. This is a very interesting graph. What this shows is that your ability as a professional NBA basketball player, your ability to make the free throw, on average is the 0 line over there, the dark line going horizontally at 0. And that's your average throughout the season. But you actually perform way less than average if your team is behind by 1 point, because that puts a lot of pressure on you, in that situation. And so if your team is behind by 1 point or 2 points, then your ability to make that free throw drops really severely. Ironically, if you're tied, that seems to be a good motivator, and so you actually perform slightly better than average. And also, ironically, if your team is ahead by 1 point, apparently because of fear of losing that lead, performance goes down as well. But the big thing about this graph is that if your team is behind 1 or 2 points and it's really on you to make that free throw, even though you're a professional athlete, your ability to make that free throw is going to go down. And of course, we see this a lot in soccer. This is a very famous penalty kick from Harry Kane in the World Cup, where he missed his penalty kick and then England failed to advance. And he takes responsibility for that. But really, it's not just his fault. It is actually common for athletes to miss the penalty kick in high-pressure situations. And so there's this interesting statistic where this pressure is higher if you're famous and well-known and there's a lot of expectations on you. So they did this analysis where if you're a superstar, like Harry Kane and such, then your chances of making a penalty kick in these high-pressure situations is lower than if you're just a new nobody in the professional league. They actually can make these penalty kicks a lot better, I guess because they're not feeling the pressure on themselves and from the audience and from the crowds. And so we feel that the best performances come when you're just kind of in flow and just not thinking and just doing your thing. As you all know from this famous goal from the Korean team in the World Cup. And this is just a video of just a very beautiful play where it's clear that they're not thinking, they're just doing. They're just executing what needs to be done to reach the target and make their goal. And there's even this direct quote from the greatest snowboarder in history, Shaun White. He literally said, "There's no time to think. When I'm not thinking, is when I'm riding the best." Okay, you're just letting your body do its thing, letting your training express itself. This is a famous quote from the baseball player, coach, manager Yogi Berra, who has a lot of these kind of wise, pithy quotes, that kind of says something obvious, but also has a lot of wisdom and truth to it. So he's famous for saying, you can observe a lot by watching. And he's also famous for this quote, which is, how can you hit a baseball, and how can you hit and think at the same time? And his point is absolutely correct, is that there is just no time to think and to hit a baseball, a pitch that's coming at you at 90 to 100 miles an hour. And so I'm actually going to take a little time to show you what it means to not have enough time to think. In professional baseball, the time it takes for the ball to leave the pitcher's hand and to reach the catcher's mitt or the plate, is only 400 milliseconds, which is the time it takes to blink your eye. It only takes 400 milliseconds, and yet the batter does not even have all that 400 milliseconds to think. Just to see the ball leave the pitcher's hand, that takes about 100 milliseconds for your brain to process that image. And then from the moment you decide to take a swing and actually make the swing, to make contact with the ball, that's already 150 milliseconds. And it takes your brain about 25 milliseconds to tell your body to start your swing. And so what that means is that there's very little time, only in that green zone, about 100, 250, 275, so about 125 milliseconds to kind of decide whether you're going to hit the baseball or not. And then on top of that, in order to hit the ball into the field, to put it in play, you literally only have about a 7 millisecond window to bring that bat to the right position in this three-dimensional space. So long story short is that you have to let your brain do its thing. And if you start thinking about whether you're going to make a hit or not, or what you had for lunch, or like thinking about the pressures of the moment, that then it's only going to screw you up because your brain just doesn't have the time to make all those thoughts. And in particular, the more you think about making a mistake, or the more you worry about making a mistake, the more likely you are going to do so. So here's a famous experiment from a psychologist, Dan Wegner, and many others, is like if I ask, and it's hard, it's hard to control your thoughts. And this is an experiment that shows, like if I ask you as an audience member, someone watching this talk, if I ask you to not think about a white bear, okay? So, a big white polar bear, in a zoo or in the Arctic, don't think about that, okay? Are you able to suppress that thought? It's very hard, even if just my act of telling you not to think about it makes you want to think about it. And that's kind of what happens when people choke, when athletes choke, when you don't do well on an exam, is that you get distracted and you lose control over your focus in order to perform your best. And so people end up very frequently thinking, saying, or doing something that they don't want to do because of these intrusive thoughts. Again, in professional soccer, many sports, they take advantage of this by creating distractions, such as before a penalty kick. They'll try to increase the time where you have to sit there and think about your penalty kick and making the kick, famously done when Argentina won the World Cup last year. But fundamentally, the advice, one-line advice that a psychologist and neuroscientist can give you is don't think. Just do it. Just do. Just perform. Again, famous quote from Nike. Again, if you worry, if you think too much, it's going to mess you up. And so what we're going to talk about a little bit now is how can you avoid worrying? How can you avoid thinking about the wrong things? How can you just do it? We know from brain research that someone who's really good at what they do, their brains show calmness. They're cool. They're focused. And one of the main reasons we think this benefits you is because your brain has lots of different systems, and in particular, your thinking conscious system is separate from your motor system or many of the other brain systems that exist that work directly for athletic performance, again, musical performance, and even many kinds of speaking performances and so on. This is well studied in the lab using putting games, because that's something you can do indoors. This is a study that shows first on the x-axis, on the left you see novices, on the right you have expert golfers. So experts are better golfers and they're better at putting a ball into a hole. So the bars on the left are higher than the bars on the right because novices do worse. When they putt the ball, it is less close to the target than it is for experts. Lower is better. But what we have here is something very interesting, is that you can ask an expert someone who's really practiced at what they're doing, to either focus on putting, their stroke and how they're hitting the ball, or you can just distract them by having them monitor some random sounds, mainly just to help them stop thinking about the actual motor movements of their putting. When you do that for a novice, then they get messed up, as you would expect, because they're not very good to start with. So the white bar is higher than the black bar on the left. But what's cool about this is that if you're good at what you do, which is, I think, the domain in which we really are talking about today, if you're good at what you do and have practiced a lot at what you do, then actually thinking too much about how you do it, thinking too much about your putting stroke, thinking too much about your violin, skills, and so on, thinking too much about the skill itself is going to hurt you, and you're actually better off not being distracted. And another way you can replicate this result is by either asking the pro or the expert to focus on accuracy or to focus on speed, just hurrying up and just getting it done. And actually, the experts are better off if they don't even think about the accuracy, which perhaps may cause them to think about their stroke and other things instead of just, getting the ball in the hole. So long story short, unlike novices, experts putt better when they're not thinking about their stroke. So it's just empirical evidence for what I've been showing. And so the advice that I'm going to try to reinforce is, no matter what sport or no matter what kind of performance, think about what you need to do, what you're trying to achieve, your goal, and just doing it rather than thinking about how you're doing it. So in other words, like for example in archery, focus on the target. Don't worry about what your arm is doing. Don't worry about what your bow is doing. Just think about the target, and then your body will naturally know what to do to make the best performance. In fact, if you're good at what you do and you're only focused on the target, this is a fun study showing that for golfers who had a good round, who played well that day, if you ask them to come back after the end of a good round, what the size of the golf hole is, they actually think it's larger. To them, the hole looked larger on the days they performed well compared to those who didn't perform well. And of course, the better you are at golf, the hole looks larger, even though, of course, it's the same size for everybody. And you can even play around with this a little bit, where imagine this is a golf hole. These are two identical circles. They should look the same. You can change how they look just through perceptual context. This is something that psychologists have been doing for hundreds of years. So there's this famous illusion here called the Ebbinghaus illusion, where depending on what's in the context, the same circle I just showed you, they both look like the same size, but now the one on the right looks larger than the one on the left, again, because of the contrast with the neighboring circles. And a clever psychologist actually did this in the lab, where they had a putting green in the lab, and then they had a projector on top of the hole, and they made the hole look smaller or larger, and by using the same illusion. And even though the hole was the same, when you made it look larger like this, people putted much better at this game. And so obviously you can't put projectors on golf holes in a real life, but the point here is that this is all in your mind, and it all depends on how you're perceiving things. And so you have to think about how can you focus your mind so that you're thinking positively, so that you're thinking in a goal positive direction, something that will help you attain confidence and good performance. And so I like to show these ambiguous images, again, from psychology, where you have to demonstrate to you that you have the ability to control what you see. So how many of you see a lady looking into a mirror in front of her vanity? Okay, you can see a lady looking into a mirror. But also, if I tell you that this also looks like a skull, you can see it as a skull, and you can focus on seeing this as a skull, where the lady's head is now one eye, and then her reflection is another eye, and with a nose in the middle and teeth as the vanity. So this can either look like a lady looking into the mirror or a skull, again, depending on what your mind decides to focus on and what it decides to interpret it as. And so, and interestingly, in sport, what you focus on can actually change your performance and actually change your training. And sports psychologists know this very important principle, which is when you're training in various kinds of, in many kinds of sports, how you focus and what you focus on really matters. And there's this distinction between focusing and attending to your body movements versus something called external focus, where you're really more attending to body effects and the target. And depending on what you ask the athletes to focus on, their performance is going to be different. One example is this device, which you can put in a lab, and it requires skill. Your goal here is to kind of move back and forth as if you're skiing. And first you need to hold the bar because it's actually pretty hard. And then as you get better, you can move back and forth at greater amplitudes. And the amplitude is what's shown on the y-axis on the bottom. So you will start to be able to make wider movements as a good skier would with practice. But you train two different groups of people in this study. One group was told to focus on their feet and putting pressure on their left and right foot and leg, depending on which direction they're going. And then the other group, the external group, got a very similar instruction, but was asked to focus on pressing down on the ski and not worrying about your body movements, but just saying, press down on the ski, press right, press left. So the only difference was basically whether you're focused on your leg and foot or whether you're focusing your attention on the ski. And you're much better if you're focused on the ski, on the external target. And the researchers think that this is because when you're focused on the target, when you're focused on the ski or the ball or the club, it causes it allows your automatic brain systems to control the behaviors. Whereas if you're worried about what your body is doing, then you're actually interfering and slowing down with the natural body movements that will allow for better performance. So just as one other example, in volleyball, if you're teaching someone how to hit a volleyball serve, and in the internal focus condition, you tell people, shift your weight from the back leg to the front, arch your back, accelerate the shoulder, the upper arm, then the lower arm, and finally hand. This all makes sense. You're thinking about the form by which you're hitting the ball. But sometimes it's just better off just, reminding people to focus on the target and, yes, shift your weight, hit the ball, and, but hit it like a whip, like a horseman driving horses. And literally, if you do this in a lab situation, the external group, shown in black, performs better than the internal focus group, shown in white. And the top two lines are for the experts, and the bottom two lines are for novices. And this basically works for both new players and expert players. So attention does help you focus on the target, the goal, and that in turn reduces distraction, anxiety, stress, and also takes away internal focus so that you can actually perform better. My own lab, we study attention, and we develop measures of attention and focus. It's very complex. Attention is such a complex skill that it basically uses up most of your brain, as shown here in the network figure on the top right. But we found ways to measure that with brain imaging, and allowing us to predict when someone will perform a task better than when they do worse. And we can also look at individual differences between people. I'm constantly interested in ways to improve this attention network, and so I look at work in the literature to demonstrate this. Some of the most powerful ways to enhance attention actually is meditation, long-term meditation. This is another study, not from my lab, that scanned the brains of expert meditation practitioners and compared them with novices. And there are huge brain differences that are associated with your ability to focus and maintain focus for long periods of time. Same thing, meditation practitioners are also better at controlling and managing their emotions. And so they are less startled and less anxious and less responsive to emotionally salient disruptions. And this is borne out by brain imaging studies as well. But what I want to close with here, meditation, most of us don't have the ability to meditate for long periods of time for many, many months and years. Meditation can be just annoying for some people. So what is one way to enhance our attention that every one of us can try to strive for? And that turns out to be something that we do every day anyway, and it's sleep. The more sleep you get, the better it is for your attention systems. And this runs contrary to what many people think. There's this notion, again, kind of I alluded to at the beginning, like the harder you work, the less you sleep, that's how you achieve success. But actually it's the opposite. Research shows that it's the opposite, that not getting enough sleep is actually very harmful to performance. Some people can get by with it, but on average, most people will benefit from getting more regular sleep. And so this notion that sleep is bad for you and it's a waste of time is pretty far from the scientific truth. And it's a problem because most industrialized, advanced nations, the citizens are not getting enough sleep. This is the case in America. And actually, here's something you need to worry about, especially here in Korea. Korea is actually the worst in terms of not getting enough sleep and accumulating, fatigue and sleep deficits. And so here's why that's bad for you. Sleep is when your brain forms its memories. What you study during the day or what you train for during the day, all of that gets kind of wired into your brain while you're sleeping. And so if you disrupt the sleep, then this learning gets disrupted and you will retain less of what you learned the prior day, whether it's a perceptual task, whether it's kind of like a school-based kind of task or motor task, piano, so on. All of this benefits from sleep. As shown in this graph, sleep helps memory. The effects are small for very simple material, but the more complex the material is, shown here, sleep benefits you much more compared to not getting enough sleep during the night after you study. So sleep helps memory in general, but even more when you're dealing with confusing memory material like organic chemistry or other kinds of complex memorization material. Again, going back to athletics, this is a really neat study where the varsity basketball team coach participated in a study that required his players to get more sleep at night. They were required to take at least 9 hours of sleep a night, at least be in bed for that amount. And when they did this for a month, shooting accuracy improved by 9%. This is work done by Stanford sleep researcher Sherry Ma. She demonstrated with the Stanford team that their shooting accuracy improved by 9% just by getting more regular sleep at night for a long period of time. But this benefited all different kinds of measures, not just shooting, but also running and other kinds of subjective measures as well about how players felt about their game. And then this is something that is, again, not from my lab, but it's directly related to the kinds of things that we do in my lab, which is attention. Very simple computer task, a little boring, but it measures your ability to maintain your attention, and it's a measure of fatigue, brain fatigue. What we have here is the data from people who got about 8 hours of sleep a night, and what you have on the x-axis is the percent of times they make a mistake, and the y-axis is for how long they kind of doze out or kind of lose focus. So basically, any dot away from 0, 0 is bad, and this is what it looks like for people who get enough sleep. What do you think this will look like if you pull an all-nighter? Okay, that's going to show up in the top left. And as you would expect, if you pull an all-nighter, actually 2 nights in a row, then you just can't even do the simplest of tasks because you're tired and you're sleepy. So this is obvious that performance gets worse when you're pulling all-nighters. But what's beautiful about this study is that even if you're getting sleep every night, if you're not getting enough sleep, if you're accumulating sleep debt like South Korea is, then that's kind of almost as bad as pulling an all-nighter. So if you know that pulling an all-nighter is bad, then you should also understand that you need to get more than 4 hours of sleep a night, and even more than 6 hours of sleep a night. So if you ask people to sleep for 6 hours a night, which feels like a lot for some people, for 2 weeks, then you're still performing pretty badly on this very, very basic task. In other words, you're not performing your best. So chronic restriction of sleep to 6 hours or less produces cognitive deficits equivalent to up to 2 nights of total sleep deprivation. Just 2 more things. This is a very visual picture for me when I try to remind myself of the importance of sleep. These are actually glial channels. And the main point here is that, even as recently as 10 years ago, scientists have demonstrated that an important function of sleep, which is basically it allows your brain time to clean itself. And so during sleep, the brain cleans itself of toxic metabolic byproducts. And these glial channels, which are, basically it's kind of like brushing your teeth or, running it through the dishwasher and so on. They open up, and that's when your brain, because it's so busy during the day, doesn't have time to clean itself. This is when all the toxic byproducts get cleansed away from the brain, is during sleep. And this was first demonstrated in the mouse, but it also has subsequently been demonstrated in humans. And so again, when I talk to myself, why should I sleep? Well, it's like, would you kiss someone without brushing your teeth? Or would you eat off a dirty plate? The whole point of sleep is to clean itself so that it can function better the following day. And then, this slide is a very famous work where they recorded from this brain structure called the hippocampus in rats, and they recorded from these brain areas while the rats were dreaming, while they were sleeping, and they demonstrated that the activity in the brain was replaying what they had recorded during the day while the rats were running around in mazes. So if on the top is the brain recordings of the brain of the rat kind of navigating mazes, then it's very clear that this activity is replayed while they're sleeping during dream sleep, and in fact this has a causal role, because if you disrupt this REM sleep, then the learning is impaired. And so literally there's direct brain evidence that this replay during sleep plays a critical function for memory and skill learning. That work was by Matt Wilson at MIT and many others. So as a closing slide, this is just a reminder for all the students in college that getting more sleep is better. You may think that you need to sleep less to study more, but this is a direct correlation actually published earlier this year showing that the less sleep you got, the worse your GPA is going to be at the end of the term. And it was published in PNAS earlier this year. Okay, so in summary, I hope that some of what you learned today, what I shared today, will inspire you to relax and feel less stressed and just really focus on what you're trying to achieve. And again, like we don't want you to feel that life is a race. Just do your thing, and hope you are able to reach all your goals and be happy in the process. So thank you.
Today I'm going to talk about the similarities and differences between computers and our brains, and what methods we can use to try to understand both of those, including the similarities and differences between them. And I'm going to focus on one particular method to try to understand brain and how to develop better AI using games. So there are a lot of similarities between our brains and computers in terms of what they do, but in terms of how they're constructed. So if you, for example, look at the human brain on the left side, it has roughly 100 billion neurons, and each neuron is connected to about 10,000 other neurons. And therefore, if you count the number of connections in the brain, there's roughly about 1 quadrillion connection points between the neurons, which we call synapses. So one very simple approach that you can take to try to compare the brains and computer is to find out analogous parts in computers and count how many there are. And in computer, that corresponds to a part that we refer to as a transistors, because it also functions as a kind of switch. And nowadays, if you look at the fastest computers in the world, which as a few years ago is a Frontier in America, it already has more transistors than the number of synapses in the human brain. So if you just look at the hardware, we already have computers that might be actually more powerful than our human brains. But how about the function? But I've also like to mention that even though they might have similar computing powers, human brain uses only 15 watts of power, whereas this Frontier supercomputer uses about 21 million watts. So it's you can say that human brain is about 1 million times more efficient in terms of energy that it uses to do the same job. But how about the function? So if you compare what the brain does and what the computers do using the latest algorithms, AI algorithms, then there are also some similarities. So a lot of what the brain does is to recognize patterns and identify whose face this is, what kind of object you might be watching. And in the last 10 years or so, AI programs actually also made a lot of progress. So nowadays, we can expect comparable performances from humans and AIs in recognizing different objects very fast. Another area of functions that's common to both brain and AI is decision making. So brains obviously is the organ of decision making in your body. Again, in the last few years, AIs have made a huge progress in terms of making decisions that are very challenging decisions that even humans have some difficulty in. And that's another area of like self-driving cars and lots of other sort of AI algorithms are making huge progress in that area. But there are certain functions that I think it still mostly remains unique to humans, and that's setting the goals. So far, we basically developed AIs to do the things that we want to do, but humans are lazy, and therefore we like to let AIs and other machines do it. But so far, we're setting the goals, and I think that's as an area of key differences between what the brain does and what the machines do, because I don't think that humans will want to free the machines like we're free slaves and then let the machines do the things that it wants to do, because I think we want, until the end, I think we want the machines to do the things that we want to do. And what I like to focus on today is on developing AIs. A lot of AI developers actually in the past have used games to test their performance and also find better solutions to build better AI algorithms. And this has been also true for brain researchers as well, because games has a certain convenient properties that are nice to use in studying the brain functions as well, not just in developing AIs. So one example would be if you look at the kind of watershed moments in the history of AI in the last half a century. Then, for example, in 1961 was a year when people, for the first time, developed a simple AI algorithm that can play tic-tac-toe optimally. And then took several decades until 1997, where IBM famously developed a Deep Blue to play chess better than world champions. And then a few years ago, this happened in Korea. The DeepMind developed AlphaGo that can play Go better than world champions. And a few years later, some other computer scientists actually even developed AI programs that can play poker, which is way more complicated than Go, actually at the superhuman level. And to zoom on the work of one particular company, DeepMind, that I just mentioned, I'm showing this to illustrate how rapidly these kinds of progresses have been made. So this company is relatively young, but in 2015, it already developed an AI algorithm that can play many different versions of Atari games. And then only a year later, it is when they developed AlphaGo, and then have a program that plays Go better than humans. And a few years later, a lot of you are probably familiar with StarCraft. They released an AI algorithm called AlphaStar, which plays StarCraft better than humans. And this is kind of remarkable because compared to Atari and AlphaGo, where the configuration of the game is relatively well defined. So if you just watch a snapshot of a game in these simple games, you can kind of get all the information that you need to play, choose the optimal action. But AlphaStar is a visually very busy game. You have to sort of analyze a lot of visual patterns. And AlphaStar could basically take the pixel images of this game and then still play in real time against the human champions of StarCraft. So the progress has been very rapid and remarkable. So what is game? I think this is a little bit confusing, but because there are two different sort of usage of the word. So in our common language, this is what we mean by game. So if you look at Oxford Languages, for example, game is a form of play or sport, especially a competitive one, played according to the rules and decided by skills, strength, or luck. So the key word here is the rule. So games are nice and as a testbed for developing AI because unlike all the decisions that we make in our daily lives where rules are actually not clearly defined, oftentimes it's very difficult to know what is a good decision, what is a bad decision. But this is much clearer because it has a mathematical precision in defining what are the rules and then what are the possible moves and what are the goals and so on. So this is one sort of usage of the word game. But there is another more restricted use of the word game, mostly in economics, and especially a branch of economics called game theory. And this is a more technical definition of a game. A game in game theory refers to a social interaction among multiple players, where the outcome for each player is determined not just by that person's own choice, individual choice, but it's determined by the chosen strategy of all players. So it's a social interaction, and game theory is a mathematical tool to study the optimal strategy that one can choose in such a dynamic social pattern, but social interaction. But even in this case, just like in the common sort of colloquial use of the game has to be precisely defined in a mathematical way. So that gives you the advantage in using games to test AI algorithms and also to try to study the brain functions. And that's something that our lab has started to do about 20 years ago because it was actually from about early 2000s when people started using the games in the second sense of the word, where you are using sort of virtual or real social interactions where the possible actions and goals are really well defined, and then try to understand how the brain comes up with an optimal strategy or nearly optimal strategy in social setting. So for example, this is one of those examples that was published about 20 years ago when people started putting people in an MRI machines and then started measuring the patterns of brain activity while the subjects are playing chess inside a magnet. So our lab's interest and my interest are a little bit different compared to these fMRI studies because we'd like to understand the functions of different neurons in different areas of the brain at the level of individual neurons, which are the basic building blocks of information processing in the brain. So what we do, I'd like to take a moment to introduce the technique that we use, which has a very long history in systems neuroscience. So what we do is that we bring an individual small electrode inside the brain closer to a particular neuron, so that we can measure the electrical activities that are generated by the individual neurons. And we can do this in different parts of the brain. So, for example, if you do this, as shown in this pioneering studies of Hubel and Wiesel more than 60 years ago, if you measure the activity of a single neuron in the primary visual cortex, where the visual information from outside the world first reach the cerebral cortex, then as shown in this slide, diagram, you can see that the activity of a neuron in the primary visual cortex, for example, changes depending upon the angle of a line that's moving across certain area of the visual space. And this is what's known as orientation tuning. And then similarly, if you then move to another part of the brain that controls the bodily movements, primary motor cortex, then you can see that the level of activity, which can be seen by the density of these little dots, which corresponds to action potentials, or as we call it, spikes. That's a repulsive electrical activity that you can measure from individual neurons. And you can see that the density of these dots, or we call it firing rates of a neuron, changes as a function of direction of your arm movement. So in the sensory cortex, the neurons encode sensory parameters. In the motor cortex, the neurons encode motor parameters. And then if you then move even further interior to the part of the brain in areas like prefrontal cortex, then you can find that the activity of the neuron will reflect the kind of information that you're holding in your memory. And then if you go to another part of the brain and measures the activity of dopamine neurons, the neurons that release dopamines in multiple parts of the brain, then you can identify the signals that are related to learning in the individual neurons as well. So our lab study using, as I mentioned earlier, games, virtual social interactions, to study the functions of high-order brain areas such as the prefrontal cortex. And we started with the simplest game that you can imagine, which is a two-person competitive game. And penalty kick is an example of that kind of game where there are two players that have opposing goals, and then one person's win is the other person's losses. So it's a highly strictly competitive. And the choice you can, in this case, be simplified as defending left versus right, or kicking the ball to the right versus left. So it's a binary choice that are made simultaneously by two players, and outcome is strictly competitive. So we implemented a game like this in a lab, where the monkey is playing a competitive, this, by the way, in game theory, this is a game called matching pennies. It's very common in Korea too. In Korean, it's called hol짝. And the nature of the game is that there are two players. Each player makes a binary choice, and one player wins if two players make the same choice. The other player wins if the choices of the two players are different. So what makes this task different from all the other game decision-making tasks that have people studied in the laboratory is that the computer opponent, in this case, is not passive. So while the animal is making a series of binary choices across many trials, computer has a relatively simple AI algorithm, so to speak, and it in real time actually analyzes the monkey's choice, and then try to predict what the monkey will choose in the next trial, and then choose the opposite target. And then gives the animal reward only if the computer chooses the same target as the computer. So you're kind of incentivizing the animal to make unpredictable choices, just like the penalty kick shooter or the goalkeeper is not trying to display any intrinsic biases. Because if you know that, good players would not do that. But if you know that a particular shooter is always shooting the ball to the right side, then that'll make the job for the goalkeeper really easy. And while you have an animal that's trained to do these kinds of tasks, we can then measure the activity of neurons in many different parts of the brain. So here is just one example neuron from the prefrontal cortex that was recorded while the animal was playing matching pennies. And we found out that the neurons in the PFC during this kind of game carries a lot of signals that are related to the animal's previous experience. And it makes sense because while you're making these repetitive virtual social decisions or any other decisions, it's important for you to remember the choices that you made in the past and how successful those choices were. And we show that the prefrontal cortex plays a really important role in linking your past experience to your current decision making. And then we made some changes in the matching pennies because we were interested in the role of not just reward or no reward. In other words, whether your action produce a positive outcome or no outcome. We were also interested in as to how your choice is influenced by positive outcomes and negative outcomes. Because in our, even in our lives, oftentimes the consequences of decisions are actually very painful and negative and punishing. So we were interested in studying how the brain handles those kinds of yin and yang, two opposite outcomes of the choices. So we modify the matching penny so that an animal could experience a loss. And after briefly considering the possibility of giving physically unpleasant outcomes to the monkey, we settled on using tokens, which obviously has a long tradition in psychological research. So in this particular experiment, what we did was that instead of just giving the animal reward, like juice, drop of juice, no reward at the end of a trial, we decided to give an animal a small token, which is shown in the form of a red disc in this case. So after the animal's a choice in a given trial, at the end of a trial, we could either increase the number of tokens, which will be a gain for the animal, or we can maintain the same number of tokens, which will be neutral, or we can actually take one token away, which the animal doesn't like, just like all of us. And then we can iteratively go through these many different trials and then see how the animal changes their behavior depending upon whether the previous choice led to gains or losses or neutral outcomes during this game. And found out, here is one video that you can see what this looks like in real time. So you see in the middle of the screen a various number of tokens, which increase or decreases its number depending upon the animal's choice. And the small red cross is the animal's eye position. So in this task, the animal is basically choosing either the target on the left or target on the right just by making a simple eye movement. And then the outcome is initially displayed by the color of a feedback ring that appears briefly, but then that leads to changes in the token number. And then when the animal acquires 6 tokens and the trials pause briefly, and then these tokens are exchanged with 6 drops of juice, just like now. Okay. And this graph is complicated, but it simply shows that animals more likely to choose the same target if that previous choice, choosing that same target in the previous trial led to the gain outcomes, which is shown by the blue lines, and they're more likely to switch to the other target when they're punished by choosing a particular target and then lose the token as a consequence. So it shows basically, just like the psychology, more than 100 years of psychology research has shown that gains and losses of these tokens are reinforcing or rewarding and punishing as we would expect. But then that was not the goal of our research. Our goal was to find out how neurons in different areas of the brain respond to gains and losses. And here's one neuron that recorded, again, from one part of the prefrontal cortex, but in this case, it's also medial prefrontal cortex, slightly different part of the prefrontal cortex than the previous neuron that I showed, which during this feedback period, which corresponds to this gray background, this neuron increases activity maximally after the animal loses a token, compared to a neutral condition, which is shown by this green line, and then does not increase its activity very much when the animal gets a token. In other words, when the outcome was a gain, which was interesting. But what's more interesting was that this differential sort of activity that occurs as a result of different outcomes of the animal's choice is sustained. So it actually lasts more than a few seconds, indicating that these neurons actually might be a substrate of your memory about your recent actions and the outcomes, even when the outcomes could be gains and losses. So that's what these different panels show. Okay, and then we also found that these neurons could be involved in allowing you to switch between different strategies. So one of the things that's fascinating about the decision-making in reinforced learning is that for solving complex problems, you actually have an option of choosing between many different strategies, which we can refer to as some kind of meta-learning. And we found that the activities of these, some neurons in the DMPFC or dorsal-medial frontal cortex, which look very complicated if you just look at the activities across different conditions. But when you try to correlate them with the tendency for the animal to switch between two specific learning algorithms, then the activity of these neurons was actually relatively correlated with how likely the animal would be to abandon a current strategy and then switch to different computational strategy, learning strategy. So that was kind of unexpected finding for us. Okay, and then another example that I'd like to share with you is what we could learn, for example, by using rock, paper, scissors, which sounds, is a very similar game to matching pennies in that it's a competitive two-player game. But when you look at the behavioral choices, choices that people or animals make in rock, paper, scissors and try to analyze the neural activity during that game, you could actually learn a lot more about how the brain solves these kinds of problems. And I'll first explain as to why that's the case. So everybody knows rock, paper, scissors. We've done this countless times. So a game goes like this. So you would, let's assume that you choose a rock, and then your opponent or friend chose a scissor. So you won. Then most learning theories will predict that since the outcome was positive and you might be reinforced, and therefore you're more likely to choose a rock in the next trial. So let's assume that that's what you did. This is, for example, what's referred to as a rin-stay strategy, and it's a very almost most obvious predictions that a lot of learning theories, including reinforced learning theory, makes. But let's assume that in this particular trial, that your friend this time chose a paper, so then you lost. So then again, most learning theories will predict that you're more likely to switch to another choice. But because there are three possible options in the rock, paper, scissors, like the matching pennies, those two other alternative options are now scissor or paper. And if you try to make that prediction based upon the simplest learning theory possible, then you might think that you would be equally likely to switch to both of these options. There's certain kinds of learning theories that will predict that probabilities will be different. So, one example is something that is referred to as a belief learning. And the key feature of belief learning is that in order to decide what you're going to do next, you're going to do some kind of mental simulations, right? So before you actually make a choice in the next trial, what you're going to do is that you're going to simulate the following outcomes, possible outcomes that might occur. In that, if you, for example, chose the scissors in the current trial, you would have won. So that's a counterfactual reasoning, because you're imagining that in this current trial I lost, but if I had chose scissors, then you would have won. And then you also similarly doing the simulation that if I chose the paper, that I would have tied. And then if I, you already know that you lost by choosing the rock. And if you do this kind of simulations in your head, that you might predict that in the next trial that you're more likely to choose a scissor. So by analyzing whether you actually tend to choose the scissors more often than the paper, in this particular subset of trials, you can actually test whether your agent or animal or person is using this kind of learning strategy, and that's what we did. So we simplified the rock paper scissors because we didn't want to train the monkeys to play this game with the hand gesture. So we just simply displayed three identical green targets on a computer that map onto scissors and rock paper scissors, and they correspond to rock paper scissors depending upon which one chooses, and then the predictions that are made by the computer algorithm, the animals will get different amount of juice. So this is somewhat unusual rock paper scissors, in that usually when you play our common everyday rock, paper, scissors, win is a win. But in this case, the amount of juice that an animal receives changes depending upon whether you win with rock or paper or scissors. And we did that because we wanted to identify the neural activity that's related to the expected outcome in terms of how much juice the animal receives from the win versus loss. But that's not particularly important. And here's one example neuron that we recorded from yet another part of the prefrontal cortex called the orbitofrontal cortex. And historically, this part of the brain has been very closely linked to the analysis of your decision outcome. So that's why we went there. And what I'm showing you over here is that an activity of single neuron in the orbitofrontal cortex sorted by three different factors. So different rows. So, for example, top row corresponds to all the trials, the activity of all the trials where the animal's choice was a top target shown at the top of a computer screen, and the middle row corresponds to the trials where the animal chose the rightward target, and the bottom row corresponds to the trials where the animal chose the left target. And then the different columns corresponds to the position of the target that would have been the winning trial. Okay, so this is, for example, if the top target was rock, then these are the trials where the animal chose, if the animal would have won by choosing the top target, etc. And then different lines corresponds to the amount of juice that was available in that trial. So you can see that this particular neuron increases activity maximally in those three conditions along the diagonal, which means that they're firing more, their activity is increasing when the animals are winning. And then activity is actually increasing systematically according to the amount of juice that animal receive, which is what you expect for this part of the brain. But that's what was already known. But in addition to those kinds of outcome coding neurons in the OFC, we also found neurons that makes you believe that the monkey might have had regret, because when you're playing rock paper scissors, because if you're doing that kind of mental simulations implied by the belief learning, then you would be you'd be thinking about the counterfactual outcomes. So unlike the previous neuron, you can see in the activity of this neuron is very different, because they're not firing in those 3D panels in the diagonal, but they're firing more in conditions that are not at the diagonal, which means that this neuron is firing more in the trials where the animal's either tied or lost to the computer. And the activity of the neuron is increasing, not according to the actual amount of reward that animal receives, but according to the amount of imagined counterfactual reward that animal could have received. So this is very reminiscent of our experience of regret, because I could have done this and that the outcome was better. So we think that we found a neurophysiological evidence of regret in the monkey brain. Okay, so the last example that I'm going to show you is the most complicated game that we have studied in the lab. This is our ongoing project. And this is in collaboration with a theoretical neuroscientist at NYU, Wei-Ji Ma. And we studied this collaboration almost 8 years ago, actually. And what his lab and he and his student came up with, they actually spent a lot of time to try to come up with the optimal game that they could study, not just in humans, but in monkeys as well. So they try to sort of project different games in this two-dimensional chart where the horizontal axis shows the complexity of the game. Of course, we'd like to study the most complex game that we can study. But then there's a trade-off, because as the game gets more complicated, it makes us harder to understand the nature of the computations that has to take place in order to play the game. So he refers to that as a modelability. So there's a trade-off between the complexity of the game and the modelability. And of course, games that we were using in our lab, such as matching pennies, goes to this area, right? It's a relatively simple, but it's very modelable. And on the other extreme, we'll probably have something like Go, which is very complex, but it's very difficult to model. And he decided mostly, and we agreed with him that we can try to come up with a game that has intermediate complexity. And it's something that we refer to as a samok, which is slightly simpler than omok. I think many of you are probably familiar with the omok, where the goal is to place four of your stones in a straight line, either vertical, horizontal, diagonal, before your opponent does. It's that you're taking turns with the opponent, placing one stone at a time, and then your goal is to place 4 stones in a row first. And you just watched one game that was played by 2 novice players. And this game is not too complicated. It's much simpler than Go, so that you could actually model how a rational player or player that's learning this game using a particular algorithm might play. So here's a prediction of a model that they built, which colors the board according to the probability that the models assigns that, in this particular case, this agent should place this stone here. So redder a box becomes, the model's is getting more confident that's where the next stone occurs. And you can see that this model is doing a pretty good job predicting where the next move will occur. And we started training monkeys to play this game for a few years ago. And here is the trajectory of a hand movement. So we train an animal to place a stone with a joystick, and you can see that the red dot starts from here. This is the starting position of a monkey, and he's basically moving his cursor from this location to that location. So that's his final choice in the particular move. And the gray stones are the place where the computer already has a stone. The other blue circles just to show you where the animal already has a stone. So you can see that in this particular move, the animal is deciding to block the computer's move before it plays to try to make 3 in a row. And in addition to that straight sort of cursor movement, what you see here is the eye movement, scan patterns of his eyes. So you can see that he's checking these 2 possible locations before actually deciding to block the computer's stone. So you can tell already a lot about what the animal might be thinking just by analyzing the eye movements. But our goal is to, so you can watch one particular game, maybe 1 or 2, as to how this happens in real time. So small yellow circle is animal's cursor. And then again, that small red cross is where the animal is watching. That's animal's eye position. So computer just blocked the animals 4 in a row. So he almost had it, but it was blocked by the computer. So he lost because computer got the 4 in a row first. So you get the idea. And we're actually quite fortunate because I didn't think that this would be possible when I was a graduate student. But in the last few years, a lot of new techniques became available, which is beginning to allow us to record from hundreds of neurons in multiple brain areas simultaneously. So this is what the recording chambers that we can put in multiple places, and the animal's skull looks like. This is an MRI picture of different targets, different areas of the brain that we're interested in. What I'm showing you over here is one particular type of electrode that has 64 channels in them so that we can record from dozens of neuron activity simultaneously. But nowadays, there are actually better electrodes that allow us to record from more than several hundred neurons at the same time, and you can actually implant multiple of these in different areas. So here's the data from 128 channels that are filtered in different bandwidth. And the data that I'm plotting over here is only for 400 milliseconds. You can imagine that if the animal's playing this game for an hour, we can get a huge amount of data that we can analyze. So here's what these massive amount of data look like. So on the top left, you'll see what the animals, the games that animals are actually playing. On the right side, you're going to see 128 different windows. And each of those windows actually is going to show you the shape of an action potential that we are recording from each of those channels. And then those individual waveforms that are recognized as potential spikes will be displayed on the right area. And then you're going to also hear a soundtrack that tracks the activity of one particular neuron that recorded from dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. And you can try to guess as to what this neuron is trying to tell you about the game that animal's playing. You might have noticed that just before the end of the game, the activity went up a little bit. And we can listen to another trial to see whether that is a reliable observation. Right, again. So you just saw 2 trials where the monkey is winning, and in both of those cases, this activity of this neuron was increasing. So we can do this for more than an hour. Animal will play, in some cases, several hundred games. And if you just plot the activity of a single neuron for the entire session where animal played, in this case, almost 400 games, it looked like this. So, the time base here is, more than almost 20 seconds. And you can see that this particular neuron, for example, tends to increase its activity gradually during the time. very difficult to figure out what's going on. So we do a lot of analysis to try to understand what they might be. One, for example, example would be to sort these different movements that occur inside a game according to whether it's a first movement, second movement, third movement, et cetera, et cetera. You can see that this, consistent with what you saw at the top, you can see that this neuron has a tendency to increase this activity according to the number of movements that animal makes. But if you do this, if you look at it a little more carefully, you can actually easily find out that what this neuron is really doing is the likelihood that animal is winning in that particular trial, which is shown at the bottom right in this case. And then there are lots of other analysis we can do. For example, this shows you that many of these electrodes will have an oscillatory patterns in their field potential. And this is a plot that's referred to as a spectrogram that shows you the tendency for the signal to oscillate at different frequency as a function of time. And when you make these spectrograms, for example, as a function of the stones that are connected, you can see that there are some interesting patterns emerge. So, that oscillatory patterns of activity, for example, decreases as the animal approaches the final goal of making connecting 4 stones in a row. So I just showed you several different examples in games that my lab has studied in the last 2 decades to try to understand what the function of the brain might be in learning to play these different games better. And as I mentioned in the beginning, this approach is the same approach that you can use to develop different AI algorithms as well. So there's a very fruitful, exciting interactions between developing new eyes and brain research. Thank you for your interest.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Professor Lee. Today, I'm going to tell you about our work to date, creating a digital twin of the brain, and I'll tell you more about what I mean by that throughout the talk. So, myself, I grew up as an electrical engineer. I went to Seoul Science High School in Korea, then went to Seoul National University, majored in electrical engineering, then also majored in electrical engineering all the way throughout my PhD at Stanford. But then around the time I finished my PhD, my grandma had a stroke, and that was my firsthand experience to understanding how we have no solution to brain health care. And so right at that moment, I decided to switch my career, going from an electrical engineer to someone who's working on brain health care. And for that, I decided to take a very specific approach of creating a digital twin of the brain. And you can, in a way, summarize that as an effort that's perhaps taking the strongest path of resistance. And fortunately, however, throughout my effort to create an approach that will provide alternative diagnosis and treatment of brain disorders, there were numerous funding that allowed me to pursue these goals. And I would like to thank them for giving me this opportunity. So currently my lab is at the Stanford BioX. My lab is on the upper right-hand corner. When I showed this picture to someone one day, they said, "Oh, it looks like your lab is the whole building." But no, it's the upper right-hand corner. That's my lab. And after 10 years of effort, we also started a new imaging facility called Neuroscience Preclinical Imaging Laboratory, where we had a inaugural symposium in 2022. And we are continuing to hold this every year, and I would like to invite many of you to these symposiums in the future. Brain health care, as you may all be very well aware, is a growing concern. It's a bigger problem today compared to yesterday, and it's also a bigger problem tomorrow compared to today. There are many disorders, including neurodegenerative disorders, which is mostly in the elderly population, and neurodevelopmental disorders such as autism, which is a disorder that is a problem from a very early age throughout your life. And also, there are many disorders such as infectious disorders, which also are now known to cause brain disorders. And so just to take an example of autism, in 1970, there's 1 in 10,000, but today it's about 1 in 36. So brain disorder is a #1 cause of disability worldwide. There are about 1 billion patients worldwide. And in the US alone, the cost of care, this is not cost of cure, this is cost of care, is about trillion a year. So this is clearly a very big problem. And recognizing this, not only many companies and universities are working on these problems, but there are significant investments that are being made at different governmental levels. And so in the US, in many countries in Europe, UK, have really put significant amounts of money trying to address this problem. But while there are many advances that are being made benefiting from these investments, there are still no clear solution to date, and this curve is not changing. Not a single technology is changing this curve yet. And so, for example, in the field of trying to treat Alzheimer's disease, there were many, many clinical trials which all cost about $1 billion that have failed repeatedly. But fortunately, in the past 2 years, there were 2 different drugs that were FDA cleared. However, even these cleared drugs have limited efficacy and very significant side effects. Because of significant failures in trying to develop drugs for these very serious illness, there have also been new efforts in the realm of digital therapy to try and use non-drug approaches to treating neurological disorders. However, it is very unlikely that these approaches will provide cure for serious illness like Alzheimer's disease. On the other hand, there are technologies such as electroceuticals, which is directly delivering current to a specific region of the brain to stimulate the brain circuit in an effort to normalize the brain function, which is very logical from an electrical engineer's point of view. But one of the biggest problems in trying to do this is that these are done in a trial and error basis. It's not that we know how the brain works and, okay, there is this function that is erroneous, we're going to fix it, so we're putting the electrode in. This is mostly that, okay, there are some clues that show that this area might be involved in this disorder, and it does not have any serious side effects by putting electrodes there, so people put it in there, which also leads to $500 million trials, and oftentimes fails. So here, one very important problem to note is that no matter what approach you use to try and cure brain disorders, brain healthcare, brain disorder treatments, ultimate goal is to restore brain function. That is not a debatable fact. We do not judge whether Alzheimer's is cured by whether the plaques are all cleared from the brain. Ultimately, the measure of success is to see if the memory is restored. And so, in order to restore brain function, one of the key missing ingredients is that we are unable to measure brain function in a meaningful way that would allow us to restore its function. If you are trying to do something as simple as manage your weight, you need to be able to measure your weight. Imagine trying to manage your weight by looking at the mirror. Depending on how you feel that day, you might feel like, oh my God, my belly's a little smaller today. But that would be a very inaccurate measure and difficult to do. And that is a one-dimensional parameter to manage, and yet that will be extremely difficult. Current state-of-the-art examination of brain function looks like this, where you go to the hospital, you either have a conversation with the doctor as to what the state of your brain function is. Did you fall down? Can you remember this? Try and draw this and that. Or you can fill out a questionnaire that asks you these different questions, not in an interactive manner, but rather in a sheet that is shown here. So when your assessment of the problem is this inaccurate, as in, if you had your cell phone that's broken and you took it into a store to fix it, they ask you whether you dropped it in the water or did it hit the hard surface. Those are all very useful information, but trying to restore the cell phone's function just using that information would be extremely difficult. So it is critical to directly measure how the brain circuit's elements communicate to create the different functionality that you're interested in. In other words, to create a digital twin to be able to allow this new approach of measuring brain function and directly targeting that as a way of treating brain disorders. And so, what does it mean to create a digital twin? I would like to emphasize 3 different aspects. One is you need to be able to replicate the data you measure from brain function. Another important aspect is you need to be able to explain how the brain's different behaviors arise as a result of being able to create the digital twin. Simply being able to replicate it oftentimes will allow you to understand how to create that function. More importantly, to be able to do things that you're interested in, such as diagnose and treat, you need to be able to predict the outcome of an intervention that you can apply to this digital twin, which needs to match the actual physiological outcome in the twin, the actual brain that you created the twin for. So with this goal, for the past 15 years, my lab has been trying to take different approaches towards the singular goal. So our first approach was to create a brain circuit analysis technology where you can start to measure how different cells in the brain communicate with the rest of the brain. Then, once we had a technology where we can do that, what we have done is to apply this to try and understand how different neurological disorders engage the brain circuit. And that took about 11 years to publish the first paper associated with diseases to understand its mechanism. Then, last year, we were able to publish on a successful outcome of creating a digital twin, taking the brain to a point where we can do three things: replicate brain function, understand its mechanism, and predict its outcome. So the basic approach we took is, first, we divided this problem into a smaller unit where we wanted to see for a certain behavioral unit. In this case, this is a very simple behavior where we optogenetically control a very specific cell type in the brain, where in this case you can see the mouse turning in one direction. And we wanted to reconstruct how this behavior arises. And that means being able to draw a communication diagram associated with what this behavior entails. And so on the right, you see a diagram of different parts of the brain communicating with each other in order to create the behavior that is seen on the left. This particular circuit that we manipulated is involved in many disorders, including Parkinson's disease. And what this is showing is that for this particular behavior to occur, the brain circuit communicated in a particular way. And so to make that diagram, what we started with was to use optogenetics technology, which allows us to genetically target very specific cell types, D1, D2, medium spiny neurons in this particular case. And then we use simultaneous optogenetic functional MRI to measure the outcome of manipulating very specific neurons. Just like our investigation of, let's say, a cell phone, if you had a volume up and down button and you press those buttons together, it would be very difficult to understand whether even that button is related to volume. But once you start to press them separately, it becomes very obvious what its role is. And so that's the idea of utilizing a genetic technique to very specifically control brain circuit elements. And then, once we had the ability to specifically control and image the whole brain circuit, we then approached to image various circuits underlying neurological disorders. And we also did single unit recordings to validate that these measurements done by functional MRI actually matches the underlying electrical activity. Then, once we had this four-dimensional data related to very specific circuit elements, we reconstructed algorithms underlying this behavior that's observed. And so here we're showing you two different cell types that is engaging the whole brain to result in different behaviors. And so what we have at that point is a freeway diagram. It shows what the traffic looks like on a freeway scale in terms of who's talking to who in order to create the behavior that you observe. Then, what we wanted to do, in order to get to more details of how the brain works to create a digital twin, we then utilized electrophysiological recordings at different areas to build a model at the biophysical level of single unit spiking and create the underlying model. And here, this is an example of what we have done. And you can see here on the top row, that's an actual measurement from 4 different regions, putting electrodes in specific regions. And the second row is the digital twin created outcome of what the single unit electrical activity would be like. And that's for one experimental scenario on the top 2 rows. And another experimental scenario where we do D2 medium spiny neuron stimulation is in the bottom row. And you can see that the actual measurement and the digital twin gives spike rates that are comparable, which shows that it can actually replicate the outcome that was measured in real experiments. And through this approach, I'm not showing you the data here. Through this approach, what we have also found is that we can explain mechanisms that were very difficult to understand just by looking at the data. And we can also then make predictions on what nodes can be stimulated in order to, for example, create an outcome of eliminating beta band oscillations. Once we had this digital twin that can model the brain function, what we then wanted to have was an understanding of how different pathologies, which has been the primary target of drug development, relates to brain function. And so to enable this understanding, what we have done is inject, in this example, alpha-synuclein fibrils into the striatum. And we use brain clearing technology combined with AI to automatically segment and quantify these different information. And since this is an invasive technology, we monitor this in different subjects for about 18 months. And once we did that, we could quantify how these brain pathology spreads, also aggregates, and then degenerates over time. And so using that information, we also then built a computational model to quantify its whole dynamics. And so once the dynamics were quantified, we could see that the count of plaques that were created in the brain and also our prediction matched very closely. Then, by using public resources like Allen Brain Atlas, we could then also map how these different spreading, aggregation, and degeneration parameters map into the different gene expression levels, giving us better understanding of how different genes relate to these different spreading, aggregation, and degeneration process. After modeling all of this, we went to the point of trying to understand what the relationship between function and pathology is. And here, we found something that was very difficult for us to imagine, but seeing is believing, where what we have found is that on the left, you see images that show the result of neuromodulation. And when we modulate in the motor cortex, in this case, we see that some areas have increased activity, indicated by red. Some areas have decreased activity, indicated by blue. And on the right, what we're showing is that that same neuromodulation, functional changes resulting in different changes of the alpha-synuclein aggregation. And this shows that areas where there is decreased brain activity, there is increase in brain pathology, and where there's increased activity, there's decrease in brain pathology, which is very nicely summarized in this plot here, where you can see that increased activity, less plaque, decreased activity, more plaque. So what this says, potentially, is that brain function changes are very closely tied with pathology, and perhaps restoring brain function, although it is our goal, might also have an impact on restoring different aspects of plaque that we want to remove. And so they are very interactive, and restoring brain function is not only going to restore the brain function, but perhaps also remove pathology that we are interested in not having. So we can now create a digital twin and understand the relationship across function, pathology, and genes. So the digital twin can now replicate brain function, help understand how the brain generates function, and make predictions on how to alter the brain function. Also, now we see that the brain function can alter brain pathology, which has a very big implication for therapeutics design, and gene expression and pathology dynamics can also now be quantified, which will guide us through many different therapeutic strategies. And so in order to take all of this information and translate it into treating human disorders, I founded this company called Elvis. Remember, initially, as an electrical engineer, I got into this research of brain disorders because I wanted to treat human brain disorders. And so far, we have done a lot of these experiments in animals in order to understand how the brain functions. Now we want to take this to the human brain level. So Elvis has built this solution called NeuroMatch. And the vision for this is, what would the future of brain healthcare look like with a digital twin that'll help us look inside the brain? So when I was interviewing one of the candidates for our lab, I asked, do you know what we do? And they said, oh, you're building a GPS for the brain. And I was like, okay, that kind of makes sense. Not GPS of the brain, but GPS for the brain, where you can navigate through brain function to design different things, such as therapeutics that you're interested in. And so what NeuroMatch is built on are some of these principles that are laid out here. First, we use AI to automate analytics. Advanced insights can be taken with speed. When you have brain recording data, there are lots of data that you have to look through that is very difficult for human cognition to go through very quickly. And so AI is employed to automate them. And also, we create integrated 3D digital models of the brain. Another very important aspect of the NeuroMatch technology is that we built everything based on web-based tools. This was very important because of the fact that we have increasing brain disorder population, and that also means that we have very limited access to doctors. And so the limited number of doctors being able to see patients worldwide is a very important aspect that we need to address at this point. And so to enable collaborative result-based care unconstrained by the walls of a hospital, we made a web-based solution where anybody can access information, given the access, so that you can do healthcare in a much more worldwide network. Also, because you have access to more advanced information about the brain network, you can start to optimize treatment. So these abnormal brain networks can be localized to different areas of the brain where you can start to select optimal therapy for each patient. Because everything was a guessing game so far, it was impossible to do that. But now that you can directly see what goes on, for this network to be optimized to this other state, you can start to say, okay, I need to intervene at this point with neuromodulation or with drugs to normalize this type of brain function. Another important aspect is that now that you also have these information, if you don't have the tools to normalize brain function the way you want, you can also start to develop new therapeutics targeted at this network normalization that you can start to design. So to give you a glimpse at the solution that we've built, I'll give you a short video overview. And in this video, what you can see is that in order to streamline the process of seeing so many patients in a much more efficient way, we built a database so that you can search very easily. They're all centered around people. Either you're a physician who wants to see all of your patients, or you're looking for information for a particular patient. You can easily sort in an online database to look at where different patient information lies. One time, a physician friend told me that sometimes these days, when I go to the hospital and try and find the data from the previous day, the whole hard drive is erased and I can't even find it. There will be no such problem. Everything will be very neatly organized in a database. And also, using AI, just as shown in these examples, you can easily search through different areas of the data to look at important events related to disorders. Also, then, brain networks are built and you can watch them in 4-dimensional videos. And you can see here that in this particular patient, important areas of the brain related to the disease is highlighted, and you can see its progression over time. And these windows can pop up, zoom in order to make it easy for you to understand what is happening at each time point. Also, then, these information can be sent to reports very easily. Physicians nowadays have to open Word documents to try and figure out, I think this patient has this information, and then they try to put it in documents and then upload them to different databases of interest. But now, you don't have to do that. You can easily take screenshots and then send them to the report that you want to create. That is automatically created also, so that whether it is for the purpose of diagnosing and making decision on the patient or for future research, it will be very easy to look through this information. And also, different reports associated with the patient is automatically generated. This is also, again, a web-based tool, so you can just open another window, web browser, and it will have these information fully summarized, the AI-detected events, and also different network nodes associated with the disorders. And the screenshots that you've sent will be part of the report. And so, with these approach, we are now targeting different disorders, and our first solution for epilepsy will be released this year in 2023, and also different solutions on Alzheimer's, sleep, Parkinson's, and autism are solutions that are being actively worked on. And just like an iPhone, where you can not only use the applications that is provided to you by Apple, we are also going to enable it so that the physician can start to contribute to different network observations that they can make with the systematic tool that is now in place. So Elvis is a company located in Palo Alto. We have branches in 2 different branches in South Korea, and also a branch that is now developing therapeutics with these tools. And the goal of this effort is to create high-throughput, cost-reduced care with improved outcome. And the users of the technology will be healthcare providers, payers, insurance providers, as well as individuals who can now take charge of your own data to maintain your brain health. And so our goal is that we will create diagnosis and treatment for improved outcome at a lower cost. This approach, we believe, can transform brain healthcare ecosystem in different ways. For one, because this is a web-based system that we built for people that would normally have difficulty accessing healthcare due to the shortage of doctors in remote places. You can get remote care where your brain information can be readily read. Patients and families can now start to take charge of their own data. And hospitals, normally this type of information would only be even partially available at big hospitals in advanced countries. But now these hospitals can coordinate with clinics and private practice to deliver these solutions in a much wider way. Also, MDs, nurses, technologists were all separately contributing, having discussions about how to integrate this information. But now, through this web portal, the information is automatically collected and is very easy to collaborate among different people. Most importantly, invasive surgery, drugs, and nerve stimulation, instead of delivering them in an ad hoc manner, hoping and dreaming that it will be useful for a patient, we will be able to design and predict outcomes associated with that. And also, administration, IT will be very easy. Insurance and governments that are very significantly suffering from increased cost will now be able to decrease costs associated with brain healthcare. And so our dream is to deliver integrated and scalable care. With that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Jinyoung Lee, for the sharing your very interesting concept and your data about the digital twins. Thank you. And now, with the speakers back on the stage, we'll start the discussion session. To facilitate a vibrant exchange of ideas, we have prepared some series of questions beforehand. This may be could serve as a fun icebreaker, these questions. these days, Korean young generations share their MBTI types as an icebreaker. Do you know your MBTI type? Yeah,
ENTJ.
Yep, I'm the same. ENTJ.
okay.
I don't know, but I
I'm
want to be
guessing.
like
I'm guessing that.
I'll call
I'm
myself
guessing that
ENTJ.
Professor
Okay,
Chun's
so
also
you,
ENTJ.
all of you have, So I think this is a very honorable place because we have a very esteemed the scientists in one place here, but they are all have the same type of MBTI. It's very impressive. Do you think? How do you think about the MBTI? Do you?
And what is yours, Dr. Lee?
Oh, mine is definitely INTJ. Is
Yep.
Is
Very
the type?
close.
You know that it's type of a scientist, type of architect. Yeah, the ENTJ is a kind of the type of entrepreneur.
I think that's the stereotype. Yep.
Okay. All right, it's interesting. All right. So, do you agree with the concept of MBTI?
I
like-
did it for fun, and actually there was a. I went to in the spring there was a meeting that was organized by the Korean Foundation for Advanced Studies, and when students introduced themselves, I actually saw that everybody mentioned their MBTI type first.
Yeah.
So after that meeting, I came back home and then actually tested it myself, and then that's how
Okay.
I actually found out. Yep. But I think that it's obviously oversimplification of individuality, right? Because in my case, for example, even though I'm officially ENTJ, my extrovert score is only 52, so it's very close to the border between
Introvert
introvert and
to-
extrovert. So I think when you basically try to summarize your personality with those 4 letters, I think you oversimplify things a lot, and then it sort of misses a lot of subtleties across different individuals. So I think you should be careful. I don't think you can take it too seriously.
Oh,
I agree with Professor Lee. Of course, it's an oversimplification, but I think what that allows us to do is mainly recognize that we all think differently. And once you see that you have different categories of people who think differently, even though the categorization may or may not be correct, it actually helps trying to understand each other. For me, I actually found out I did the test when I was at some leadership training opportunity, and we first of all had this opportunity to divide people into introverts and extroverts, and we started telling each other what we don't like about each other, and it was very, very eye-opening because extroverts never really think about certain aspects, while introverts, what extroverts do is very uncomfortable for them. So in a way that it allows us to think that we are actually different in ways that we think about things. I think that's the way it's helpful.
Actually, I'd like to make one additional comment. That is that I think that these types are not fixed, and I think that's really important because I always consider myself as an introvert, but my job is a professor, so I always have to talk to people, and I think that if I did this test like 20 years ago, I think I would have been like INTJ.
I see.
And I think it's recognized that this is like a summary of who you are now, and therefore I don't think you should see that as your fate, for example.
Recently, you published the book, and that's the concept and the key point of the book is intelligence is a special quality of life, right?
Yes. Yep.
So the question is, have your views shifted at all after ChatGPT, or do you have any brief opinion on the AI hype?
Yeah, the short answer is that it did not change my view because I don't think that ChatGPT actually has that sense of any real intelligence. Because as many people have said, I think that it's a sophisticated parrot. And some people actually refer to that as a sophisticated tape recorder because its main function is actually try to predict what the next word's going to be when you give it a linguistic input. And I don't think that actually captures, as I mentioned, the essence of intelligence. And I think that some people, I think, have overestimated it's what it could do in our society. I think it's just like many other tools. I think it's a very important tool. And therefore, short answer to your question is that it did not change my view. And I think that there's definitely hype. And I think it's inevitable. So whenever somebody comes up with a new tool, new invention, there's going to be always a hype. I think it's important to recognize it as a hype.
Oh, yeah, because we have a lot of questions. We also have the question about, oh, yeah, I think this is interesting. I give this question to Marvin Chen. Okay. Do you think the utilization of AI is changing the way we think, perceive, or handle the information? So what do you think? Yeah.
I'm very excited about the developments in AI because I think the goal of AI is to serve people and to make our lives better or more convenient. In fact, if I had a choice, I also like to call artificial intelligence, I call it augmented intelligence. Again, the goal is to do things that people do, but faster and better and at larger scale and in a more automated way. So I'm pretty optimistic about how AI can be used to benefit life and people. Of course, there's a lot of hype and there's a lot of worry, but overall, because the goal of AI is to help people and to mimic and to augment human intelligence, I feel pretty good about what's happening now.
Okay. I think we can receive the more comments from Dr. Daly and Jinyoung Lee as well about this issue, because the further beyond the AI, we have lots of technology and advancements. Do you think this kind of the technology advancements are reshaping human intelligence? What do you think?
I think it's very important what Professor Chen said. AI is an inevitable development in a sense that AI is artificial intelligence. Humans work for our well-being, and in doing that, we want it to be more convenient. So instead of giving very direct instructions, we want it to do a lot of things without telling it direct instructions. So artificial intelligence is, in a way, an inevitable goal. But one thing that's very important that should be emphasized is the goal. ChatGPT does not have a goal. Without the goal of serving humans, it can go in very wrong directions. It has a lot of different problems. And also, in a way, the way I think about intelligence is that intelligence can be simply put as a decision-making power, but that without combining it to a goal of human well-being, it becomes a very dangerous or misunderstood tools. And so I think it's very important for us to take a step back and also all agree that AI is not something we're competing with or making it for any other purpose than serving the human race. And it will be very important for us to set that goal very clear.
Dr. Lee,
I don't have anything to add. I think that all the important answers have been already addressed. Yeah, I think it changes what we do in very specific ways, but I think you need to look at it on a case by case. I think it's very difficult to make a general statement.
Right, yeah. Oh, and I think this question is also very, very important these days. These days we have a lot of intensive discussion on the AI ethics and regulations, right? Do you have any comments on this issue? Do you think as a neuroscientist, that we can add very unique insight on that?
I think.
So anyone, you can.
I definitely think that neuroscientists and psychologists and behavioral scientists overall have a lot to say and should have a big voice about the use of AI and AI ethics. As you know, AI is only as good as the information it's trained on. and there's a lot of bias and prejudice and harmful information out there. And so, as humans and as social scientists, we need to educate and we need to regulate AI so that it becomes like a good human being, like a good person. I think education is critical. You have to give it good information. You have to give it true information. And it's only going to be as good as you educate it and as you train it. And for that, I think social scientists and scholars and humanists, as well as engineers and scientists, all should should play a big role in AI ethics and regulation.
I agree and disagree with that statement, which is, yes, we have to educate it right, but I don't think that's enough because AI machine is not a human being. And so fundamentally, because of the difference in its existence, it cannot make certain decisions that are only uniquely achievable by humans to serve the humans. Therefore, I think it's very important to make sure that certain decisions are never made by AI. And so in that sense, I don't think it's a matter of only training AI well. A very well-defined goal that we can all agree on, curing some disease or doing some mundane task that's very difficult for humans. Certain well-set goals, we should let the machine make decisions. But a more fundamental human existence-related things that are ambiguous to define and something that we, even as humans, would sit down and discuss should never be made by AI.
I see. I think that's very important point. Yeah.
I agree with that in principle, but I think that as AI becomes more sophisticated, I think this is why I think that ethics actually becomes more important, because it will not be always easy to know what decisions should be left to the humans and what decisions you could delegate to the AIs. And I'm actually going through some interesting changes in my attitude or my perspective on this, because when I was a student, when I was much younger, I was very radical reductionist. So I thought that all the human problems could be solved if the science and technology advances sufficiently. And the recent development in AI is actually making me somewhat skeptical about that view, because I think that it's going to take too much long time for humans actually to develop, sufficiently accurate understanding of the human identities. And I think AI is developing faster than that. So I'm personally beginning to think that we need to study philosophy and history and ethics and humanities and social science more than before, actually, because it's not that easy for humans to have a complete sort of really good understanding of who we are. And before we can actually finally understand that, I think AI can do a lot of damage. I'm not an AI pessimist. I'm an AI optimist, but I think that we still need to be prepared.
Okay. Now I think we have some questions on your talks. I was very interested in the Marvin Chen's talk, and I wonder, you talk about the principles, say about the don't think principle. Especially, you introduce a lot of sport examples, and I wonder, can you, or have you ever tried to apply those kind of a principle in your life, the daily life?
Yeah. I'm very interested. And I study performance because I'm a terrible performer.
Which is not true.
In critical situations, I don't feel I'm at my best, and so that's why, as a psychologist and as a neuroscientist, I like to study all of these principles. And so I'm very good at telling other people what to do, but I don't know how to teach myself how to do it well. But in general, there's one principle that I'm very good at, and that's sleeping. I love sleeping. Sleeping is so important to me. And I will do everything possible to have a good night's sleep. So sleep is one thing I'm able to do. It's easy.
Do you have any comments? Yeah, based on that principles? Do you have any comments
I think,
to?
yeah, I mean, I think in
students?
general, people
Yeah.
don't understand how important sleep is. I still, when I talk about this in my teaching or just talk about it in everyday life, like, if you go to a hospital, you see how poorly the patients can sleep. It's still very clear to me that there's not an appreciation for the importance of sleep, despite mounting scientific evidence of all the positive functions that sleep have for both physical and especially mental health.
I see. Yeah, thank you.
I can also testify to the fact that even before I listened to anything Professor Chun said, I was actually actively using all of his tips in my own life.
That's great. So, now
I
you're
was
very
excited
successful.
to see that there's scientific facts behind it.
You're a top performer, like a pro athlete.
All right, so thank you. And now I have a question to Dr. Dale Lee. You talk about the principles of the games. And my question is, do you play games when you have a free time?
So I played StarCraft a little bit, long time ago when it first came out. I was not good at it, and I once went into the online sort of platform, and I think I just played once because I was just slaughtered completely, and I just could not compete with any players. And I also like Go a lot, and I don't have any partner to play Go with, but I watch.
AI.
That's true. That's true. So I could probably do that, but I watch the championship games a lot. So for example, I watch Shin Jin-seo's game. Yep.
Yeah, because I asked this because I was very poor at gaming. So yeah. Then the real question is, you talk about the principles of the games and brain sciences, and the economics in brain sciences, right? And do you think really your brain perform very economically? Because sometimes I feel like my brain is not so economic.
Yes,
Yeah.
right. So in my opinion is that economic theories are very elegant. I mean, there are beautiful theories like game theory, but I think compared to what humans do, I think it's actually very simple description of what might happen. So oftentimes, for example, economists will say that, rational players, people, person that has a perfect knowledge of the game, or economic transaction or decision making, we should act this way. And then every time when economists make those predictions, people actually do not follow the predictions. They deviate from those predictions. And initially you might think that, well, that's because humans are irrational or they're stupid, dumb, or something like that. But if you look closely, humans do not often deviate from the predictions and act superficially irrationally, not because they're really dumb, but because the problems that economists were studying were actually much simpler than the real problems that humans have to solve in real lives. So if you feel like, oh, I think I'm irrational, that's because your problem is much more complicated than the problems that economists deal with.
I see.
So to answer your question, I don't think that my brain's working the way that the economists predict that how the human brain should work. But I know that's
very complex.
That's because through evolution, we developed the brains that could actually solve much more complicated problems.
I see. Okay, thank you. Okay. All right, and I have also a question for Dr. Jin-Young Lee. Okay. Your talk, it was really, really fascinating. You're talking about the digital twins, and it's very helpful to the digital healthcare and for the treating the disease. But I think that our real brain is continuously receiving some information from external world and communicating with our body. How do you think, or do you have any opinion? Okay, the twin can overcome this limitation, or do you have any plan for future directions?
That's a really, really good question. I use the word digital twin to help make it easy to understand, but just to make it simple, what I mean by creating a digital twin in the clinical context, we create it for everyone individually at every time we measure the information. So it's not a twin, so to speak, in a comprehensive, this is Thea Lee's brain. That's not what we're doing. We're more taking Professor Lee's information at a certain time point to represent the state related to disorders. And so it is a continuously monitored outcome that we will provide. And so, like you said, it changes when you have disease. The essence that we capture for this, oftentimes when I say digital twin, people imagine like the whole complicated thing fully replicated. Actually, it's quite the opposite approach that we take. We minimize the information to the essence of what we need for that disorder information to be extracted. And that we assume to be changing, which is why we're going to take those information. Like today, Professor Lee is completely fine, but maybe 10 years from now, he won't be fine.
You won't be fine.
So it is information that we will continue
already
to
not fine.
gather to be able to restore it properly at each stage in anyone's life. Yes.
I will need your help.
Definitely will provide.
Yep.
The U.S. government has started the BRAIN initiative and has now allocated billions of dollars for its second phase. And looking at this from a taxpayer's perspective rather than scientist, okay, what are your anticipation for this big scientific project? What do you think?
Well, it's not enough money.
From a
From the
taxpayer's
the taxpayer?
As a taxpayer, I pay lots of taxes.
Okay.
I think there's nothing. It's hard to think of something more important than brain health. You know, especially in modern society, you know, it's devastating. Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, you know, damage due to stroke. It really is the most. It greatly disrupts well-being and everyday lives, and it's expensive research. So I'm grateful, of course, to the U.S. government for creating the BRAIN initiative because you need that kind of money at scale. But you know, dollar for dollar, I think we need even more investment again because it's so important to everyone's lives and well-being.
All right.
I agree with Professor Chan with one little qualifier, which is that I agree. This is one of the most important problems. We need to solve it. This is high time that we make investments. At the same time, I think both as an individual who pays taxes and even as a researcher, I think it's very important for us to all remember that this is what we are given this money for and to try and make the best of it at every minute that we spend this money.
I'd like to add one comment to that too. So, brain's probably the most complicated object that we're aware of. So I think that we also need to be patient at times. There's still a lot of fundamental principles of how the brain might be working that we probably do not know yet. So I think that when you know government's making a decision about how to invest, you know how much invest in brain research, I think they need to think about this in a multidimensional way. That of course you know we need to make an investment on the brain health and curing diseases, et cetera. But also I think there has to be also long-term investment. Like the investment that NSF made for like gravitational waves that take like many decades to see the payoff. And I have an interesting kind of anecdote that I'd like to share, and that was a few weeks ago. There was a British neuroscientist. I think Marvin knows this. Richard Passingham, who is a pioneer in the research of prefrontal cortex. He turned 80 recently, as everybody said online, virtual happy birthday. And then he made an interesting comment which caused create a lot of responses. He said that he never paid it throughout his career. So this is sort of opposite, but that's fine. That the diversity is really what I'm trying to emphasize. That he's sort of confessed he never thought about the application of brain research. He just, for many decades, he just pursue his curiosity, and he said that he regrets it. Because now he thinks that actually he should have paid more attention to disease and finding cures for the brain research. And I kind of thought that was a very, very interesting comment that he made, after he turned 80. And then what happened after that was that there was a flood of responses from his former trainees and other neuroscientists globally, saying that, I respectfully disagree. Because even though you individually might not have any interest in brain diseases and things like that, I'm working on disease X, but I was inspired by you originally. So I think that there's obviously there's a short-term investment, but I think that especially the government should never stop making sort of long-term investment, so that we'll someday understand how the brain works much better than we did today.
Actually, just a quick comment on that. On these both excellent points. I mean, I think the government is in a unique position to support basic science, but importantly, that basic science, we as scientists should not just rely on the U.S. on the government, Korean government, U.S. government, but if we produce good basic science, and just as your talks demonstrated, it attracts and inspires applications, which will then bring in private investment, and that's a good cycle.
Yes.
I think
Exactly.
So as taxpayers, yes, we should not be responsible for all science and all applications, but there's a nice circle and seed that the U.S. government funding can provide.
Yes.
Thank you very much for very important points. All right. I think this question is also is related to this. How do you choose the right problem to solve in your research or for your business? Yeah. Jin-hyung, do you have any comments? How do you?
There is no right and wrong problem to solve, I would say. I generally strive to solve problems, but I take that back. There are right and wrong problems, which to me, the right problem is what would help people. There are many problems that are problem that you can solve that would hurt people, right? But as long as it is something that is geared towards helping people, I think among that, what would be the right problem is what you are potentially good at solving and what you're interested in. That's what I followed. And personally, when I was in grad school, I never really had a strong passion for a particular problem. I was more attracted to different skills that I could learn. I thought engineering was fascinating, systems engineering, thinking about how to design systems, etc. But it was good for learning. But later on, when I embarked on my own research, fortunately and unfortunately, there was personal experience that motivated me to solve a problem. And so what I did was that was a problem I really, really wanted to solve. So I decided to do whatever it takes to solve that problem. So it made me very goal-oriented. And I think the need is always a good way to define good problems to solve.
I ask you this question first because I feel that your goal is very, very clear. So
and that was both good and bad throughout my career. But in terms of what I want to spend my life doing, I wanted to concentrate on that goal.
All right. So, Dr. Daly.
I agree. I think division of labor, I think, is important in science, especially in neuroscience, because it's such a complicated field.
That you just choose?
I think different people tend to get attracted to different kinds of problems.
Okay,
so I tend to get attracted to, basic problems. In other words, my driving,
Right.
question still is what happens in my brain when I'm thinking, and it's not gonna have any immediate practical implication, but it'll give me a lot of pleasure if I can get a clue to that answer.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Marvin?
I mean, I have exact same answer.
Okay, okay.
But also, as I said earlier, I'm, just interested in how can we make our performance better is always something that fascinates me. And,
I
and of
see.
course, by me, I mean, others as well. How can we help people be their best?
Yeah, but I feel you always like the choose very interesting basic questions, and yeah, so I think this may be the last one. This question is about education, the Korean education. Okay, so as a neuroscientist, what's your perspective on Korea's intense focus on education? Many cases we have the practice of studying ahead of one's own grade. So do you think this is as the neuroscientist? Okay, do you think this is positive on the brain development or cognitive function? What do you think?
I think I should go last because I have no children.
Oh, okay. But you have a lot of students, right? So then,
I'll go first.
yeah, okay. Thank you.
This is mostly based on my own experience. I think hard work and doing a lot of things in a lot of different ways really helps brain development. And so I feel like still every day I'm getting smarter. So that's good. Because of the fact that I address challenges every day. I think Korean educational system, a lot of times when we have discussion about education in Korea, it's often negative. Oh, we have all these, forced education that's bad for children. I actually disagree. I think that is good in a sense that you challenge them early on. And sometimes brute force learning is very helpful for connecting the dots later in life. If you don't know anything, there's nothing to connect. And so I feel like that's actually good education in some ways. In other ways, what really, really concerns me about current education is that there is no value education. Especially someone like scientists, we make very important decisions on what to be studied and how these technologies are being used. Critical thinking, knowing what good value is extremely important, but that is completely taken out of all education these days. And I feel like we are seeing the outcome of that in various forms of social chaos. And so I am a strong proponent of more ethics and value education on top of all the good brute force education that we have.
I think I'm fortunate to have a pretty unique background because I went to elementary school in America, and then I did middle school and high school in Korea and college in Korea. And also, because I served as a dean at Yale, I think I have some perspective on this. I completely agree that challenge, hard work, stimulation is good. It's good for development, and overall it's good for education. But I worry, and this is not unique to Korea, but I worry about the emphasis on results and grades as opposed to the process. At least I distinctly remember in America, and maybe it was because I was in elementary school, but I remember I loved school. School was fun. The process of learning itself is joyful and should be rewarding. But if you place too much emphasis on tests or preparing for tests, or achieving some outcome like getting into some school, that's where I think all the negative aspects of education become an issue and become a problem and cause stress. And actually, instead of creating joy, it creates stress and unhappiness. And that's certainly what I experienced in Korean education. Again, personal example. So as long as as long as we focus on the joy of learning, because learning is it can be some of the most human, fun activity in the world. I mean, there's nothing
Right.
there's nothing better than getting better at something. It's why we enjoy sports and so on. But again, it has to be about the process and not the result. And anything that is hurting that needs, I think, deserves review and maybe some policy, addressing.
Yeah, I agree. I hope the many students really enjoy the learning. Yeah.
There's
Thea?
too much competition. I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
why they're trying to like study things in advance, right?
Right,
Because
right,
that
right.
parents and some students might think that that's going to give them the competitive edge they need to
Right.
then get further success, which is understandable to some degree. But I think that competition comes with a cost, and I think that too much competition in education, I think, is definitely unhealthy. So there should be some, people should have some better solution.
Okay, this concludes today's session of the Chase Scientific Innovation Series. Thanks to our speakers for the informative talk and lively participation and discussion. Thank you again. And thanks to our viewers on YouTube. Okay, thank you very much.